Chapter 3: How I would rebalance the ammunition types in World of Tanks. Everything I'm going to talk about right now is definitely my personal opinion. I had a look at it with some of my friends which are playing in the upper half of, World of Tanks, in the sense of pretty decent clans, clan wars, and decent stats. However, we didn't came to a full conclusion. There were some which liked the things I'm going to propose, and there were some which were like, are you actually insane on proposing those things? So yeah, let's jump in. Weak spots and hit points. The first thing I think definitely has to come back is weak spots. There is a huge change which just happened around 9.18, where just suddenly most new heavily armored tanks didn't receive any weak spots anymore. There are just non-existent. For me, I always think that at least 2 weak spots are necessary to make the game more playable. It just also makes you as a tanker have to use your brain a little bit more than just standing there and doing absolutely nothing and being like, herder, look at me, I'm standing, hold down, you can't penetrate me. And this is obviously going towards tanks like Super Conqueror, Chieftain, 430U and even 279. However, the 279, gotta point out, the cupola is 210mm thick and is actually the easiest of those 3 to hit. However, it's still stupid as this tank has no frontal weak spot on its hull. So how would I change that in that kind of sense? So for example, we have the VK101P on tier 8. This tank, in my opinion, is quite a sore thumb. Yes, the lower plate is kind of a weak spot, and the cupola could theoretically be a weak spot, but only for same class vehicles. Everything below tier 7 and including tier 7 have basically no chance in penetrating those cupolas. The cupola has an impact armor or has a standard armor of 220mm, meaning the effective armor can be even bigger. We have to keep in mind that this armor or this tank faces off against players in tanks like a Churchill 7, which has 148mm of standard penetration, or for example something like a T150, which has 176mm and 220mm of premium round penetration. So even if the T150 decides to load premium rounds, he has no chance on penetrating the cupola of a VK101P. Well, he has a chance, but it's less than 50%. In my opinion, this is very, very badly balanced. Especially if you think about the cupola being on the right hand side of the tank, meaning if the enemy knows what he is doing, he can use different obstacles and different map terrain positions to his advantage to not only hide his lower plate but also hide his left-hand side armor of the armor. And this is something I personally account for as skill and not just having a cupola which is impenetrable. Another example would obviously be the Type 5 Heavy. The Type 5 Heavy has, in quotation marks, a weak spot in its lower plate or in its upper front plate of 250 and 260mm of respective armor. I just have to ask myself, do you really call something a weak spot in the term that you should be easily penetrated when it's 250mm thick and the surrounding armor is 270mm? In my opinion, this defeats the purpose of a weak spot if you still have to basically shoot premium rounds. The same goes for its cupola, because the cupola, with it sure being just 210mm thick, the angle and the size of the tank give it most of the time an effective armor of around 280 to up to 300mm. And this is just, if you think about it, is exceptionally unfair. So, for example, a Type 5 Heavy, in my personal opinion, should in theory lose one of his frontal weak spots in the hull, like either the machine gun or the driver's hatch. I would say the gun weak spot should be removed, but the hatch of his driver should still exist. This hatch, however, should be pumped down to at least, or at least 150, maybe 170 max millimeters of armor. So it is a weak spot which the player, the type 5 heavy player, can use to hide and can use to be penetrated. The same goes for the cupola. 210 millimeters of effective armor are way too much for a weak spot, especially a cupola. If you think about it, the armor is roughly 2/3 of a foot or 210 millimeters thick. It just sounds ridiculous if you think about it, in my personal opinion, in scale wise. So, the cupola, in my opinion, on a Type 5 Heavy could go all the way down to another 150, maybe 170 millimeters of max. So that people which are playing against the Type 5 Heavy still have a chance of penetrating that cupola without spamming gold. However, if the Type 5 Heavy is standing hull down and can hide his cupola, he should be rewarded for that, and so on and so forth. This is what I personally think about the weak spots in the game and how I would change it. Obviously, those are just some examples. If you want to have more examples, let me know in the comment section below, and I'll tell you what I would personally do. In my opinion, the pre-buff tortoise was a very, very good example of how armor on a slow-moving vehicle should be balanced. The cupola was incredibly thin. However, if you were able to hide this cupola, the tank became very, very decent. You just had to always crawl around a right-hand corner, so you could hide your right-hand side. With the buff, it got better because the left-hand side got a much stronger, but it's just very, very awkward still to use and just sometimes doesn't make... it just now feels too much, in my opinion. Next up, hit points. In my opinion, the things changed on lower tiers are great. Up to tier 5 to 6, they can keep the low HP buff, but tier 7 to tier 10, I would keep hit points as is, because it is in the end a system which is already very well established and I think by a lot of decent players already memorized. So completely shoveling everything around would make it a lot harder again to get used to the game again and get into the game again. Also to that, we shouldn't forget that a lot of different values would need to be changed if we get a HP buff for tier 8 or tier 7 to tier 10 vehicles, where for example DPG values, WN8 values, gun mark values, everything will be changed. Still, low tier HP buff, that's a good thing. Please keep that up, Wargaming. And the last thing I want to talk about is no premium round - special rounds anymore. Every single ammunition type should have its clear advantages and disadvantages. So, and again, this is very, very, very personal, and this is very, very my opinion on this. In my point of view, AP rounds should be the ammunition type with the second highest damage. The highest damage goes to HE, but I'm going to talk to that in just a second. But for that, the RNG on AP rounds should be the highest, so 25 plus minus on pen and damage, how it is as right now. AP rounds should be the just how you would usually play. It's the highest damage, highest RNG in the end. But now, how would I personally change APCR rounds and how would I change heat rounds? I'm still debating a little bit about the values, but for me personally, APCR rounds and heat rounds should lose at least 25 to maybe even 30% of their damage to lessen their effectiveness. So, in the end, I was also thinking, why not give it a step further? If you want to still be very reliable at sniping but have to get a little bit of RNG still in it, I would say that APCR rounds should lose 25 plus minus RNG, but get it down to 17.5% RNG. So 17.5% on damage and penetration. So they are more reliable, but they pay for a bigger lose over distance, fast speed, and the loss of damage. This is how I personally would balance APCR rounds. Maybe I would even give them a slightly worse normalization, so they are not as good used against sloped armor. Nevertheless, they are great against spaced armor and great for sniping when you want to hit fast targets. So then you have to decide, when I want to snipe, should I use APCR rounds, or am I skilled enough to lead properly and use AP rounds? However, then again, I need to think about, do I want to be more consistent and have a more consistent damage with APCR rounds, or should I go for the higher damage AP rounds? The penetration on those shells, this is subject to debate or discuss, in my opinion, in the comment section or in the forums below. And lastly, we have the heat ammunition type. For me, heat should have the lowest amount of RNG. Just because of this thing that in the end it's a chemical reaction, and chemical reactions usually tend to be the most consistent. But then again, this is just my personal take on explaining it. Again, maybe the damage should be around 30% less than APs, so the same as APCRs. But they should have the same amount of damage as an APCR round. But again, this is also subject to change. It is subject to discuss. Heat should have a much worse effectiveness against spaced armor, because in the end, right now, we still have the issue where the most effective counter against, for example, 103B is heat, which just sounds stupid if you think about the 103 having heat screens frontally. Like, what? It doesn't really make a lot of sense if you think about it. Heat screens should be there to protect against heat, yet heat is the most effective weapon type against those heat screens. This is why I would say that there should be changes to the calculation of penetration loss over distance after hitting armor, so heat screens could and should be much more effective against deflecting heats. Again, it's heat screens, that it's in the name. This could also lead for wargaming in further times up the river. They could think about adding tanks which are very prone to getting heat spammed, to just give them a small heat screen to lessen the effect of heat spam. I would also think that heat should have the least amount of RNG, so maybe plus minus 10% on penetration and, well, what's it called, damage, to make them more consistent. However, I would also think about maybe nerfing most heat rounds penetration rate down from 340, 350 to maybe 310, 320 max, to just give armor more value in the sense, especially as we now have more weak spots again. And lastly, about HE rounds. I talked about the HE rounds already, and I think there are some issues with them, and I think some aspects of the third iteration are good. However, this aspect is the knowledge or the algorithm which looks at the module damage. This is good, but in the end, removing penetration of HE rounds is, at least for normal tanks, very sad, because HE is a high risk, high reward type of ammunition. So the only thing I would personally change about HE is keep it as is, like on the live server, but introduce the new algorithm and introduce a tiny little coefficient on their calculations. I would even go so far and say that the HE damage at the moment it's a flat 50% off when it doesn't penetrate. So maybe even bump that up to a flat 75% off when it doesn't penetrate, to make HE spam less effective. But if you are able to know where you can penetrate with HE, makes it more effective, or keep it as it is right now. This is basically the only thing I want to change about HE. Reduce the damage they do on splash or non-penetrating hits, and keep them as it is on the live server. So we still have the skill aspect of being risky, knowing where to penetrate, finishing off a low HP target in one shot instead of two, because you are at its rear and can penetrate it. About HESH shells, I do not really want to talk about them. I was already thinking about a small little change, where maybe the more angled armor is, the more effective HESH gets. But when I was playing around Excel sheet to get a decent algorithm going, a decent formula going, it just simply didn't work out that well for me. And again, please don't forget, I am not an employee of Wargaming. I am not getting paid to do this. Conclusion. That's it. This is my personal proposal to how to change premium rounds. They all need to have the same amount of money. They should pay, or they should be the cost roughly the same. AP should be the most damaging one, or the second most damaging one, with HE being the most damaging one. APCR should be more effective against sniping, but loses a lot of penetration to do so and has a decent chunk less RNG, 30% less damage. The same goes for heat rounds. Heat rounds should be effective against flat-on armor and the ability to not lose any penetration over distance, but they are slower. And they have the least amount of RNG, plus minus 10%, so they're much, much safer. Plus, I would suggest to lower the penetration on most premium rounds by 10 to 20 millimeters in general. Lastly, weak spots have to come back. Low tier HP buff is great up to tier 7, then leave it, tier 6, leave it as is. And now I want to know, what is your opinion on my proposal? Let me know in the comment section below, and this is very, very important. This is just what I want to do. I want to give feedback to Wargaming and even give a counter proposal how we could change World of Tanks for a better thing. The things I didn't touch on is obviously that if premium rounds get lower damage, obviously highly armored tanks will get stronger. This is why I wanted to introduce more weak spots in general to make them not as overpowered as they are right now on Sandbox server. But yeah, thank you so much for your attention. My name is RagingRaptor. Take care and tank well.